My name is Lawrence Harker. I am 73 years old. And for almost half a century, this house has been the axis around which my life has turned. Though lately I feel more like a guest than the master of its walls. I built it with my own hands back in the late 70s when I was still young, full of callous determination and pride. And I remember every nail driven into the beams and every tile set carefully upon the roof, because I wanted a place not just to live, but to grow old together with Margaret, my wife, the only woman I ever loved, and the only person who could soften my sharp edges. For years, this house was not merely wood and brick, but the theater of our ordinary miracles. The smell of her cinnamon rolls filling the kitchen on Sunday mornings. The sound of our children running up and down the stairs in summers that seemed endless. The laughter echoing from the back porch when neighbors came by for barbecues, and the quiet evenings when she and I sat together in worn armchairs, not needing to speak because silence itself seemed like a conversation. When she passed away 6 years ago, it felt as if the air changed temperature, as though every room grew colder by a degree, and the walls began to echo with their own hollowness. The photographs remained in their frames. The curtains stayed on the windows, the clocks kept ticking. Yet the soul of the place had gone with her, and I carried on here like a shadow of myself, walking the corridors with hands behind my back, whispering to memories that never answered. The children had long since grown and built lives of their own, at least on the surface, because what really happened was that they built distances that kept stretching wider every year. Distances I once thought were only temporary, but which have turned into chasms I no longer know how to cross. My daughter lives 2 states away with her husband, rarely calls, and when she does, the conversations feel like obligations. Quick questions about my health and reminders about medications. Words delivered with mechanical care, but without warmth. My son Daniel remained closer, at least in miles, living in the same city. And for a while I thought that might be my salvation. A chance not to feel so unbearably alone. But over time I began to realize that proximity does not guarantee love, and blood does not guarantee respect. In the beginning, I was glad when he came around more often, usually with the excuse that it was hard to keep up with rent, or that his job had once again been swallowed by layoffs or debts. And as a father, I told myself that giving him a couch to sleep on or a meal to fill his stomach was not just duty, but a kind of repayment for all the joy his birth once gave me. I convinced myself that Margaret would have wanted it this way, that helping our son even at his age was still an act of love, because you never stop being a parent, no matter how gray your hair or how lined your face. But I noticed small things that unsettled me, though at first I refused to give them names. The way he wandered through rooms as if assessing them, the way he moved my wife's framed photo from the mantel to a corner shelf without explanation, the way his laughter sometimes carried a note of superiority when I struggled to rise from a chair because of my knees. I told myself not to overreact, that sons sometimes change when they get older, that perhaps he was only frustrated with his own circumstances and it bled into his behavior at home. The truth I resisted was that he no longer saw this place as mine, but as a resource waiting to be consumed. And he no longer saw me as a father, but as an obstacle standing in the way of his own comfort. Yet at that time, before things escalated into open cruelty, I lived in a state of uneasy denial, continuing my routines like a man walking a tightrope, while pretending the ground was not rushing up beneath him. I would wake early, as I always had, and brew coffee just the way Margaret taught me. 3 scoops, water brought almost to a boil but not quite, poured slowly in circles to release the scent that once filled her kitchen. I would toast a single slice of bread, spread it with peanut butter, sit at the same oak table where she once placed flowers in a vase, and try to let the ritual disguise the emptiness. Sometimes I would sit for an hour with the newspaper unfolded, pretending to read, though in truth I was watching the patterns of light creep across the floor and listening to the faint sounds upstairs, reminding myself I was no longer alone in this house, but not entirely certain whether that was a blessing. When you are an old man, you begin to measure your days, not by achievements, but by what small fragments of dignity you can hold on to. Mine became simple: to keep the lawn trimmed because Margaret hated overgrown grass, to keep the porch swept because she liked to sit there in summer evenings, to keep the furniture polished because dust seemed like disrespect. I did these things less for myself and more as an ongoing conversation with her memory, as though by keeping the house orderly, I could convince her spirit to linger. But even these modest acts sometimes became points of friction, because Daniel would dismiss them as pointless chores, saying, "Why waste energy on a house that's falling apart? You should let me handle things, Dad." And yet he never handled them, leaving tools rusting in the shed, leaving paint cans open to dry, leaving the gutters clogged. Slowly the house began to reflect his neglect rather than my devotion, and it frightened me how quickly decay spreads once respect is gone. What pained me more was the erosion of conversation. Where once there had been easy words between us, now there were long silences filled only by the sound of the refrigerator humming or the television that he turned up too loud. When he did speak, it was often sharp, laced with a kind of contempt he didn't bother to hide. He criticized the way I walked, the way I repeated myself, the way I stored food in the pantry, and I found myself shrinking inside my own skin, biting back replies, choosing silence because arguing only deepened the humiliation. Nights were the worst. I would sit in the living room chair, the same chair where Margaret used to knit, and listen to him pacing upstairs, his phone conversations filled with laughter and schemes I barely understood. And I felt like a tenant instead of an owner, like someone whose presence required justification. And yet, because he was my son, because I remembered him as a little boy running barefoot in the yard, because I once lifted him onto my shoulders to watch fireworks on the 4th of July, I kept making excuses in my mind, telling myself that this was a phase that under the roughness was still the boy who once clung to me when he had nightmares. A father's heart is stubborn in its loyalty, even when logic demands otherwise. I wanted so badly to believe that beneath the hardened exterior there was gratitude, maybe even love, waiting to reappear if only I endured long enough. So I endured. I endured the slammed doors, the mocking laughter, the way he took over the largest bedroom and left me in the smaller one, the way he invited strangers into the house without asking, the way he referred to the place as our home in conversations, with others as though ownership had already shifted. I endured it all, telling myself I could weather the storm because the alternative, admitting that my own flesh and blood had turned into my tormentor, was too painful to face. This is the state in which my days passed. A man who once built a home of love reduced to a lodger of tolerance. Walking through hallways lined with photographs of better years, trying not to hear the voice upstairs that reminded me with every word that the house was slipping from my control. I lived between memory and fear, between loyalty and shame, unable to decide whether I was protecting him from the world or myself from the truth. And yet, even in that quiet erosion, there was a flicker inside me that refused to die, a whisper that said this was still my house, that I had not spent my life laboring only to surrender it to disdain. At the time, I didn't know that this flicker would soon become fire, that the day would arrive when his words would cross a line so deep it could never be uncrossed, and that in defending my dignity I would reclaim not only the house, but the very sense of who I am. It was a Tuesday afternoon, late summer, the kind of day when sunlight pours through the windows in heavy golden beams, and dust motes drift lazily in the air. And I remember because I was sitting at the kitchen table trying to work through a crossword puzzle while the cicadas droned outside. When Daniel came down the stairs with a folder tucked under his arm and a look on his face that immediately unsettled me. He had shaved that morning, which was unusual, and he wore a collared shirt instead of his usual t-shirt, as though he were dressing for a performance, and his voice carried a peculiar confidence that did not belong in this house, a tone that seemed borrowed from lawyers or landlords, not from sons speaking to fathers. He dropped the folder on the table in front of me with a thud that made my coffee ripple, and without preamble he said, "We need to make things official." I stared at the papers without touching them, already feeling my chest tighten because I sensed what they were even before I looked closely. He flipped the folder open and spread out several documents across the table, gesturing with the certainty of someone who believed he had already won. "This is a lease agreement," he explained casually, as though we were two business partners reviewing contracts, "so everything will be clear from now on. You sign here, and it guarantees me rights to the house. It'll protect both of us, Dad." His smile was thin, rehearsed, the smile of a man hiding a blade behind his back. My eyes scanned the pages, and the words leapt out like warnings. Tenancy, possession, transfer, relinquish. My name was printed in the margins, but it appeared in the wrong places, not as owner, but as occupant, not as father, but as tenant, and a sickness rose in me, a mix of rage and disbelief, because here it was in black and white, the house I built. The walls I raised with my own hands had been reduced to legal lines that threatened to erase me from my own life. I pushed the papers back toward him, my hand trembling, and told him I didn't understand why this was necessary, that the house was mine, and would remain mine until the day I died. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table, lowering his voice as though confiding a secret, but in truth sharpening a weapon. "You don't get it, Dad," he said. "You're not young anymore. The world doesn't work the way you think it does. If you don't make things official, other people can take advantage of you. I'm protecting you. I'm protecting this house." His words were smooth, but beneath them I heard the unmistakable sound of contempt, the way people talk when they've already decided you're irrelevant, when they believe they are entitled to what you spent your life building. I told him I didn't need protection, that I had lived in this house for over 40 years without anyone questioning my right to it. And for the first time in all those months of tension, he dropped the mask completely. His smile vanished, his eyes hardened, and he said in a voice that will echo in me until my last day, "If you want to stay here, then get on your knees and sign it." Time seemed to stretch in that moment, the room blurring around me as though the air itself recoiled. I looked at my son, the boy I once carried on my shoulders through parades, the boy I once taught to ride a bicycle, now standing over me demanding submission like a conqueror over spoils. And I felt something crack inside. Not just humiliation, but a deeper shattering, the realization that the bond between us had been corrupted beyond recognition. He didn't say it in jest. He didn't say it as a slip of anger. He meant it. He expected me, his father, to kneel before him as if I were nothing more than a squatter in my own home. I sat frozen, my pen still lying on the crossword puzzle where I had been searching for a 7-letter word for betrayal, and how bitterly ironic that now the answer was spelled not in ink but in blood. I asked him quietly if he understood what he was saying, if he had any sense of the cruelty in those words. He shrugged, dismissive, and repeated, "Get on your knees, Dad. It's the only way." He wanted to see me humiliated, broken, diminished to a supplicant. For a brief second, I wondered if he was testing me, if somewhere in his hardened heart he still wanted me to resist so he could respect me again. But when I met his gaze, I saw no flicker of doubt, only cold determination. I told him I would not sign, not now, not ever. His face twisted into a sneer, and he stood, gathering the papers with a snap, shoving them back into the folder. "Suit yourself," he said, his voice dripping with menace. "But remember this conversation, because you're not the one in control anymore. If you think you can stop me, you're wrong. I can make your life very uncomfortable. Don't test me." With that, he stormed out of the kitchen, the sound of his footsteps heavy on the stairs, the slam of his door upstairs reverberating through the house like a verdict. I sat there long after, staring at the place where the papers had lain, feeling the weight of what had just happened. The kitchen around me seemed alien, as though the furniture had shifted in the wake of his words. The walls felt closer, the air heavier, and my hands would not stop shaking. I thought of Margaret, of what she would have said if she had been alive to hear her son demand that his father kneel for permission to stay in his own home. I could almost hear her voice, full of both sorrow and fury, and for the first time in years, I felt her absence not as silence, but as a scream. That night I hardly slept. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the creaks of the house, the occasional muffled sound from his room above, and my mind spun with questions that had no answers. How had it come to this? When had the boy who once looked up to me with trust turned into a man who looked down on me with contempt? I tried to trace the steps backward, to find the moment when our path had split, but all I could see were fragments. The day he first asked for money, and I gave it without hesitation. The day he said he needed a place to stay, and I opened the door. The countless times I told myself it was temporary, that he just needed time. And now here we were, my kindness twisted into leverage, my generosity turned into weakness. The phrase repeated in my head, relentless, burning. Get on your knees if you want to stay. It was not just a threat. It was a declaration of war, a rewriting of our relationship, a line drawn in ash that I could never erase. And in the quiet hours before dawn, while he slept upstairs secure in his belief that he had broken me, I felt something inside harden. I realized that I could no longer excuse, no longer endure, no longer cling to illusions of reconciliation. He had revealed himself fully, and in doing so he had freed me from the chains of denial. I rose before sunrise, walked through the silent rooms, and touched the walls as though asking them for strength. The house was mine, not because papers said so, but because it was built by my hands, my sweat, my love, and no one, not even my own blood, could strip that truth away. I did not yet know how I would resist, but I knew that I would, and that his demand for my surrender had instead ignited my resolve. What he believed was the moment of my defeat had in truth become the catalyst of my rebellion. In the days that followed his ultimatum, the air in the house seemed to thicken with hostility, as if the walls themselves were absorbing his anger and returning it in faint echoes that haunted me from morning to night. Daniel no longer bothered with pretense, no longer softened his words with even the faintest suggestion of respect. Instead, he began to move about the house with the heavy certainty of someone who believed himself to be master, slamming doors when he pleased, turning on lights and leaving them blazing long into the night, dropping his shoes in the hallway where I would stumble over them, and speaking to me with a tone that carried less affection than one might grant to a stranger encountered. On a bus, the transformation was not sudden but incremental, yet it was relentless, and I found myself watching as each day stripped away another thin layer of dignity, until even the simplest acts of living seemed subject to his control. The first blow came quietly, but cut deeper than I expected. One afternoon I went to the pantry to fetch a jar of coffee, only to find that my carefully arranged shelves had been rearranged, Margaret's old jars of spices pushed into the back, the flour canister gone. the packages of tea I favored replaced by his boxes of instant noodles and sugary snacks. When I asked where the flour had gone, he shrugged and said he had thrown it out because it was pointless to keep relics of the past. Relics of the past. That was how he described the ingredients my wife once used to bake bread that perfumed the house on winter evenings, the same bread that had filled his boyhood stomach when he ran in from the cold. His words struck me like stones, and though I wanted to argue, to tell him those jars were not just containers, but vessels of memory, I remained silent, because I knew he was not interested in my grief or my traditions. His goal was clear: to erase my presence, to overwrite the fabric of the house with his own careless fingerprints. Soon it was no longer just the pantry. He began locking doors that had never known keys. First the basement, claiming it was unsafe for me to go down there. Then the garage, saying he needed it for storage of his tools and that I might misplace them. When I asked for a key, he laughed as though it were a joke and told me that old men had no business fiddling with things they could not handle. My tools, hammers, saws, drills that I had used to build half the furniture in the house were suddenly out of my reach, locked away behind a door I could no longer open. It was as if he was fencing off sections of my life piece by piece, not with violence, but with quiet decrees. And each locked door was another signal that I was being reduced from owner to tolerated guest. Money soon followed. Daniel began dropping hints about his debts, how difficult it was to keep up with bills, how credit card companies hounded him, how his car payments were swallowing him whole. At first I offered small help, the way I had in years past, handing him a couple of $100 to ease the sting. But within weeks, the amounts he requested swelled into thousands, and when I hesitated, saying I had my own expenses and limited savings, his face darkened. He told me that if I wanted peace in the house, I should cooperate. That after all, he was the one keeping things in order now. That without him, I would end up in some home where strangers would spoon-feed me. The cruelty of his words was deliberate. He knew my greatest fear was to be abandoned to an institution, stripped of my independence, my memories boxed into a sterile room. To wield that fear against me was not merely unkind. It was merciless. And in those moments, I saw not my son, but a predator circling, measuring how far he could push before I broke. I began to notice small humiliations woven into the fabric of daily life. At meals, he would serve himself first, piling meat onto his plate and leaving me with scraps, justifying it by saying I had to watch my diet anyway. When I asked for milk for my coffee, he smirked and told me I should be drinking water because milk was too expensive for someone who barely needed nutrition. Once, when I set the table with the old china Margaret and I had saved for special occasions, he deliberately dropped a plate into the sink with a crash and said it was time to stop clinging to grandma junk. Each incident alone might have been tolerable, but together they formed a pattern, a campaign of erosion aimed at breaking down the pillars of my identity. The evenings grew worse. He began inviting his friends into the house, men in their 30s who laughed too loud, who brought cheap beer and left empty bottles scattered on the porch, who played music that rattled the windows late into the night. I would retreat to my bedroom, the one corner left to me, and sit in the dark, listening to their voices downstairs, the sound of my son boasting, mocking, sometimes even mentioning me in tones of ridicule. The old man still hanging on, or he doesn't even know half of what's going on. Laughter would follow, and though I could not hear every word, the message was unmistakable. I had become an object of amusement in my own home. And then there was the night when, thinking I had gone to sleep, he spoke to one of his friends with unguarded pride. I heard him say that soon the house would be his, that the old man was too weak to resist, that all it would take was a little pressure to push me into signing, and then everything would belong to him. He laughed and added that I was already half gone anyway, that nobody would question it if he claimed I was losing my mind. Those words were like acid poured into my ears. I sat in the darkness of my room, my fists clenched, my breath shallow, and for the first time I felt not just sadness, but terror, because I realized this was not simply a matter of disrespect, but a plan, a deliberate intention to strip me of everything I owned, to recast me not as a father deserving care, but as an obstacle to be removed. The next morning I confronted him, asking if he truly believed I was incapable of managing my own affairs. He stared at me with mock sympathy and said, "Dad, you forget things all the time. You repeat yourself. You lose track of your medicine. It's only a matter of time before someone notices. I'm just making sure we're prepared. Prepared for my downfall, for my erasure." The arrogance in his tone chilled me, because it was not an impulsive outburst, but a carefully constructed narrative, a story he was already rehearsing, one in which I was cast as the frail, senile parent unfit to hold on to property or money. I began to withdraw, not out of weakness, but out of necessity. I stopped eating meals with him when I could avoid it, preferring to make a sandwich in the afternoon when he was out, retreating to my room earlier each evening, locking the door not for privacy, but for safety. Yet even there, in my last refuge, he found ways to intrude. Once I returned from the bathroom to find my dresser drawers disturbed, my papers shuffled, as if he had been searching for documents while I was gone. Another time he mentioned details about my bank account that I had never shared, a sign that he had either rummaged through my files or intercepted mail. Each discovery tightened the vice around me, and I realized that his campaign was no longer merely psychological but practical, a steady gathering of weapons to use against me. The humiliation reached a grotesque height one evening when, after an argument about the electricity bill, he stood in the middle of the living room, pointed at the chair where I sat, and told me to remember whose house this will be soon. I reminded him it was mine already, but he laughed and said ownership was only a matter of paper and perception, and both could be changed. His friends laughed with him, as though it were a clever joke, but I sat there with my face burning, realizing that I had become a spectacle, that my authority had been so thoroughly undermined that even strangers felt free to sneer at me under my own roof. It was in those days that I began to feel the old rhythms of the house change. Where once there had been harmony, the ticking clock in the hallway, the soft creak of Margaret's rocking chair, the peaceful hum of a home built on love, there was now a discordant symphony of slammed doors, shouted laughter, and whispered conspiracies. The house no longer felt like a sanctuary, but like a battlefield where each step I took was watched, each word I spoke twisted, each silence interpreted as weakness. And though I had endured many storms in my life, from financial struggles to the death of my wife, I knew this was different. This was not a storm to be endured. This was a siege. And if I did not act, I would be overrun completely. Yet in the darkest hours, as I lay awake listening to the hostile rhythm of his footsteps overhead, a strange clarity began to form. His cruelty was sharpening my resolve rather than dulling it. His contempt, reminding me that I was still capable of feeling anger, and anger can be a kind of fuel. I did not yet know how I would resist, but I knew I could no longer live by endurance alone. Something within me stirred, the old stubbornness that had built this house brick by brick, and I realized that the first escalation of his war against me was also the first call to arms in my defense. I would not surrender. I would not kneel. I would not allow the son I had raised to bury me alive inside the walls I had built. It was one night in early autumn when the air outside had begun to carry that faint chill that warns of the coming winter. The kind of night when Margaret used to draw the curtains early and place another quilt on the bed, that I stumbled upon the truth in a way that left me shaking with equal parts rage and despair. Daniel had invited one of his friends over, a thick-set man with a voice like gravel and a laugh that echoed through the floorboards, and though I tried to retreat to my room and close the door, their voices carried easily through the old wood of the house. I had become accustomed to the sound of their drinking, the clatter of bottles, the careless stomping of boots on the floor. But this time their conversation cut through me like a knife, because it was about me. And there was no mistaking the words. I heard my son boasting, his voice slurred with alcohol, yet brimming with triumph, telling his friend that it was only a matter of time before he owned the place outright, that the old man was already half senile, that once he had the right papers in hand, he could make sure I had no say in anything. His friend chuckled and asked what he would do then, and Daniel replied with a kind of cruel glee that he would finally renovate the place, tear down the old photographs, rip out the museum pieces, and turn the house into something worth living in. I stood behind my bedroom door, my heart pounding so loudly I feared they might hear it, and in that moment I realized that all my quiet endurance, all my attempts to excuse his behavior as the frustration of a struggling man, had been nothing but self-deception. He did not see me as a father, not even as a man deserving of respect. He saw me as a burden to be displaced, an obstacle between him and property, a relic clinging to bricks and beams that he believed already belonged to him. The cruelty of it lay not only in his words, but in the casual way he spoke them, as though it were a matter already decided, a future carved in stone, and my existence in that house was merely a temporary inconvenience. I remember retreating to the edge of my bed and sitting there with my hands clasped together, trying to steady the trembling that spread from my chest to my fingertips. The room around me felt suddenly foreign, not the sanctuary I had built with Margaret, but a cage where the very person I had raised as a child now planned my eviction. I thought of the countless nights I had stayed awake tending to him when he was sick, the sacrifices I had made so he could have opportunities I never had, and it was as though every act of love had been twisted into rope he now used to bind me. The betrayal was not abstract. It was flesh of my flesh turning against me, and that is a wound deeper than any inflicted by strangers. The next morning I tried to confront him, my voice shaking but steady enough to ask what he had meant by those words. He looked at me with an expression I will never forget, a mixture of irritation and amusement, and said, "You shouldn't eavesdrop, Dad. You don't always hear things right. Maybe you're remembering wrong." It was a clever move, subtle and poisonous, because he was planting seeds of doubt, implying that my mind was already failing, that I could not trust my own memory. When I insisted I had heard him clearly, he laughed and said, "If you're that worried, maybe you should see a doctor. Get yourself checked out. People your age start forgetting all kinds of things. Wouldn't want you wandering off and burning the place down by mistake." His smirk was unbearable, because I understood what he was doing. Building a narrative of my incompetence, preparing the ground so that when the time came to push me aside, he could point to these very conversations as proof. That day marked a turning point inside me, because I understood at last that silence was no longer protection, but complicity. Every time I kept quiet, every time I told myself he was just struggling, I was feeding the fire that threatened to consume me. He was not drifting into cruelty. He was steering straight toward it with purpose. The stakes were no longer simply about respect or dignity, but about survival. Whether I would be allowed to remain in the home that had defined my life, or whether I would be erased, left to wither in some institution while he gutted the house and claimed it as his own. I began to watch him more carefully, noting the way he studied the mail when it arrived, sometimes opening envelopes addressed to me and leaving them on the counter as though it were nothing. I noticed how he lingered near the drawer where I kept my bank statements, how his questions about my finances became more pointed, how he asked whether I had updated my will. All of it painted a picture I could no longer ignore. He was circling closer to the heart of my life, ready to seize control the moment I stumbled. Yet even as fear gnawed at me, something else grew stronger. There was a moment late at night when I stood in the kitchen staring at the worn table where Margaret and I had once shared our meals, and I felt a surge of resolve rise in me. The house was not just walls and wood. It was memory. It was love. It was proof of my labor and my endurance. And if I allowed him to take it, I would be betraying not only myself, but her, the woman who had trusted me to guard what we built together. It was in that moment that I swore silently to her memory that I would not allow him to succeed, that I would not surrender quietly, that whatever strength remained in me would be used to defend this place against his greed. The midpoint of our conflict was not marked by violence or dramatic confrontation, but by that quiet, chilling realization. He was actively plotting my erasure, and I, in turn, could no longer pretend otherwise. From that night onward, I ceased being merely a weary old man trying to survive under his roof. I became a man preparing, however silently, for battle. The days after that realization did not calm but tightened, like a belt around the ribs, and every morning I woke with a small jolt of dread, because I knew the next humiliation would arrive dressed as necessity, which is to say he would claim it was for my own good while stripping one more small freedom from my hands. And what made it worse was the way he began to narrate me to others as if I were already diminished, a story he told with such casual certainty that I sometimes felt the house itself believed him. He started with the telephone, switching our landline to a cellular plan, so you don't get scammed by telemarketers, which sounded reasonable until I realized my number had been changed without my consent and all calls routed through his device. Under the pretense of screening, a gate he could raise or drop at will, so that when my church friend, Mrs. Ellery, tried to reach me about a service I'd promised to attend, he told her I was resting and not up for visitors. And when the bank called to verify a suspicious attempt at an online password reset, he took the call on the porch with his back to me, nodding gravely like a guardian while I stood at the window feeling like a ghost knocking on my own glass. He brought home small black cameras with glossy eyes and said they were motion sensors for safety, which he mounted in the hallway and the kitchen and on the porch, and later I found a tiny one hidden among Margaret's porcelain birds on the sideboard, the red recording light pinpricking the dark like a confession. And when I asked why the house now watched me, he answered that older people fall, that it would be good to have a record, that he was only trying to be responsible, and I understood that responsibility in his mouth meant control. He turned the refrigerator into an argument about budgets, scrawling lists on the door with a marker where he divided food into columns that read shared and personal, placing my staples, milk, eggs, bread, on the top shelf and announcing that I should ask before using anything from the lower two, and then he would forget to replace what he labeled mine, so that I was forced to ask anyway, which meant I had to stand in the kitchen like a supplicant, weighing the cost of dignity against a glass of milk. He began locking the thermostat behind a plastic cover, an absurd little cage like you'd see in office buildings, and set it to 62 in the evenings because heat is expensive, while he carried a space heater to his room and closed the door. And on one particularly cold night when my hands ached and my breath smoked in the hallway, I took a screwdriver and pried the cover open with the delicate patience of a burglar, turning the heat up and then replacing the cover and sitting in the dark, with the guilty warmth spreading through the vents as if I had committed a crime against my own comfort. In the morning, he discovered my rebellion and delivered a lecture about waste, as though I were a child who had left the faucet running. The small acts accumulated until even the most ordinary movements in the house felt like negotiations. Whether I could use the washing machine without overloading it, whether I should mow the lawn or leave it for his friend who knew the right way, whether I should move my papers from the dining room because we have company coming that never came, and each conversation ended the same way, with him glancing past me toward some horizon where I was already absent. There came the afternoon when he appeared with a woman in a powder blue blazer carrying a tablet and a smile that was too polished to be sincere, introducing her as a care coordinator who offered consultations to families considering assisted living, and I stood in my own living room while she asked questions in a soft voice about activities of daily life, how often I bathed, whether I remembered to take medication, whether I had ever wandered, and Daniel answered for me with little corrections that turned ordinary forgetfulness into pathology, a missed dentist appointment into evidence of decline. And when I protested, he patted my shoulder and said I was getting overwhelmed, that this was exactly why they were here, to help. And the word help tasted like a bitter pill that lodged in my throat. The coordinator took discreet photographs for the home safety assessment, lingering on the worn rug where Margaret used to sit cross-legged to sort quilts, on the step where the varnish was rubbed to a dull shine by years of our going and coming, on my pillbox. And I realized the inventory of my life could be turned into a case file without my permission. When she left, she handed me a folder with brochures, glossy as postcards from exile. Pictures of smiling, gray-haired people in gardens that looked nothing like the plot behind my house, and a post-it note with a date and time for a tour, if you're feeling up to it, though the appointment had already been made. That night he brought a man who said he was a notary, heavy and serious with a stamp pouch on his belt, and placed a thin stack of papers before me while explaining in a patient voice that it was just a contingency plan, a durable power of attorney. That would make things easier in emergencies. And because I had been a cautious man all my life, the kind who double-knotted shoelaces and kept insurance premiums paid, the logic hooked me for a moment, and I felt the gravity of the room tilt toward compliance. Yet something in the phrasing, a clause about real property transactions and the transfer of title to the benefit of the agent, snagged my eye like a nail through fabric. I asked for time to read. He said we had been through this and that I was being paranoid. I told the notary I wouldn't sign anything tonight, and the man looked at my son with flat, professional disappointment, packed his stamp back into the holster, and left without a handshake. Daniel did not shout, because shouting can be replayed against you. Instead, he stood in the doorway and said quietly that disappointment could be deadlier than anger, that I should think about how difficult he was finding it to keep this place afloat, that men who refused to accept help often brought ruin on themselves, and then he went upstairs, and the creak of each step rang like a little gavel declaring me incompetent. After that, he came at me sideways, not so much attacking as eroding, telling the neighbors on the sidewalk that he worried about my driving, even though I had surrendered my keys years ago by choice, telling the mail carrier that I confused bills and magazines so she should hand everything to him, telling Mrs. Ellery at church, when he deigned to drive me, that I had a good day today, as if all days were measured against an invisible scale of decline. He began to act as if my memories were suspect even when they were small and precise, such as the time I mentioned Margaret's apple pie needing tart fruit, and he corrected me, saying she always used whatever was cheapest, which I knew was untrue, because she had insisted on northern spy apples for the crust, and would walk an extra mile to find them, a devotion he now revised into thrift, because in his world all fidelity must be converted into cash terms, or it does not count. Gaslighting is a word I had heard on television without ever expecting to feel it tightening like a ligature around my sense of self, but I felt it then, subtle and steady. And sometimes I had to sit with my hands flat on the kitchen table and name things out loud. This table is oak. I sanded it in 1981. That picture is of Margaret at the county fair with the blue ribbon for quilts, just to remind the room and myself that I had not walked into a stranger's house and mistaken it for mine. Money, that constant undertow, showed its teeth again when he arrived, with a printout of my bank balances he should not have had, and announced that the cost of home maintenance was unsustainable, pointing to repairs that existed mostly in his imagination, and presenting a spreadsheet that looked official enough to withstand my outrage. A parade of projected costs for roof, plumbing, insurance, all ending in the same neat solution. Sell now, downsize, let him handle the proceeds for my care. Because he knew a guy who could invest safely. When I asked how he knew my balances, he shrugged and said the bank had worried about fraudulent activity and reached out to him as next of kin. I told him banks did not work that way. He smiled and said the world worked, how people made it work. And I heard in that line the sly pride of a man who believed rules were suggestions, and that if you carried yourself with enough certainty, doors would open that should have remained locked. He mentioned my will as if it were a document already rewritten and referred to our estate, the pronoun a little theft that sent heat to my face. And then he launched into a monologue about opportunity, how buyers were eager, how inventory was tight, how waiting would be irresponsibility bordering on madness, and I realized he had been meeting with a realtor when he thought I was asleep because he used phrases like comp set and seller credits that did not live in his natural speech. I started to gather myself in ways he could not easily see, visiting the library in the afternoon to use a computer that was not monitored by his safety devices, scanning what the county recorder kept in the public rolls about the deed and printing, copies which I folded into the back of an old hymnal, hiding the hymnal behind a row of encyclopedias he never touched, making a list of numbers on a sheet I titled Gutter Repairs, in case he glanced over my shoulder, though the digits were not repair quotes, but the telephone numbers of legal aid, the church deacon, and the post office box I rented under the pretense of protecting packages from porch thieves. I went through my desk and removed the critical papers, title, insurance policies, Margaret's ring appraisal, and slipped them into a manila envelope I tucked beneath the lining of a suitcase I knew he considered too shabby to steal. And I changed the memory code on the small lockbox where I kept our marriage license from our anniversary date to the serial number on my father's pocket watch, because Daniel would never think to ask about a history he had made a sport of forgetting. When I moved through the house, I did so with a different posture, as though I were walking not only among rooms, but among possible futures, rehearsing what I would say to a police officer if one arrived at my door with a welfare check, practicing steadiness in my voice, the facts in their correct sequence, the refusal to be baited into an old man's quaver. The second escalation revealed his motives with a crudeness he could not disguise, and it happened during an argument he started over the trivial matter of the trash cans not being pulled to the curb, a domestic complaint that flared into something uglier when he called me selfish, and I told him he should be careful with words that can boomerang. He snapped back that if I had been less selfish when he was growing up, he might have finished college, that if I had bought him a better car, he might have made it to finals, that if I had not insisted on help with Margaret's hospital bills, he would not have fallen behind on rent, and it struck me like lightning that in his ledger love registered as debt, that in his math every sacrifice was of theft from the future he believed the world owed him. He admitted, with that reckless pride liquor brings, that he owed people who don't wait, that a man had come to the house once when I was at church and leaned in the doorway to look past him at the living room and asked whether the old fellow kept cash. And Daniel said it was all under control, but his eyes darted to the side the way they did when he lied as a teenager, and I understood that property had become not a home to him but collateral, that he had measured our life in auction lots, that he was desperate enough to sell me as part of the furniture if he could find a legal clause to justify it. He tried another tack the week after, staging a kindness that was more frightening than his anger. Waking early to cook eggs and toast, and setting them in front of me with a little flourish, speaking in a tone so gentle it made my skin crawl, telling me he had been hard on me and wanted to start over, and for 10 minutes I almost saw the child he had been, the boy who would run through the yard with a stick like a sword and collapse on the grass, panting and grinning at me. Then he slid an envelope from beneath the placemat and asked if I would do him the simple favor of signing a letter to the mortgage company authorizing him to discuss the loan on my behalf, just to clear up a few items, and the eggs turned to ash in my mouth because the performance was so calculated that I felt a vertigo of grief, the realization that my memories of him could be conscripted into tricks. I told him gently that I would not sign. He nodded as if he had expected that answer, gathered the dishes with a smile, and then, as he turned away, said in a voice stripped of honey that I was making this harder than it needed to be, and that difficulties had a way of resolving themselves, which sounded too much like a threat to be anything else. Every night I listened more carefully and learned the rhythms of his life the way one learns the habits of a dangerous animal, noting when he slept deepest, between 2 and 4 by the hush that fell over the upstairs hallway, and where he hid things, because people repeat themselves even when they think they are being clever. He kept a battered metal cash box on the top shelf of his closet beneath a roll of sweaters he never wore, and inside it I once glimpsed when the closet door stood open and he hustled past me with a laundry basket, a set of keys on a ring labeled with a sticker B, which I suspected stood for basement, and a folded sheaf of envelopes bound by a rubber band that looked too official to be mere junk mail. He had bought a cheap fireproof safe and kept it under his bed, the kind with a keypad that beeps when you press the numbers, and sometimes late at night I could hear the pattern like a faint melody through the floorboards, the tones climbing and dropping, 4 notes, a pause, then 2 more, and I recognized the clumsy pride that had marked many of his passwords from boyhood, pins that traced dates important to him rather than to anyone else. And I thought of the date he considered his real birthday, not the day on his certificate, but the day he won the county basketball semifinals and announced at dinner that this was the day he became himself. I did not yet know whether the lease he had thrust at me still existed in paper form, or whether he had drawn up a new version better suited to the story he wanted to present. But I felt with a certainty that surprised me that the proof of his intentions lay nearby and that the night would come when the house's silence would be my ally rather than my enemy. The cruelty sharpened once more when he called the police to our door under the pretext of concern, telling the dispatcher I had become agitated and refused to take medication, and 2 officers stood on my porch with the rehearsed calm of men who have seen both tragedy and farce, asking if everything was all right, if there were weapons in the house, if I minded showing them my pills. I lined the bottles on the table, names facing forward, explained the dosages with the same measured voice I had used to balance ledgers in the hardware store where I worked for 30 years. And the older officer, who had gray at his temples and an air of exhaustion, asked Daniel to step outside with his partner while he remained with me and listened in a silence that felt like respect. When they left, the younger officer nodded to me as if to say he had seen this play before, and Daniel's fury afterward was not hot but cold, a narrow line of lips and a sentence hissed through teeth. "You won't win sympathy forever." It was then I understood that he hoped to produce a paper trail of instability, calls, notes, assessments, that would later be weaponized, and that my stillness, My orderliness, my clarity, were not mere temperaments, but shields I had to carry constantly. One evening, returning from the library with copies of the deed folded in my coat, I heard voices in the living room and paused in the hallway, where the shadow from the stair banister striped the floor. A woman with a leather binder stood by the fireplace while Daniel gestured at the mantel where Margaret's photo sat, and they spoke, in the shorthand of people discussing price per square foot, the woman advising new paint in greige, the removal of personal items for staging, and Daniel saying he could store the old man's stuff in the basement until closing. They moved from room to room, evaluating not our life but our footage. And when they reached the doorway where I stood, he performed a little start of surprise and said, overly bright, that I was thinking of moving somewhere easier. And the woman tilted her head and smiled at me with that professional pity which made me want to spit. I excused myself and climbed the stairs with careful dignity, my coat crinkling. The copied deed pressed against my ribs like a thin shield, and in my room I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the photograph of Margaret on the dresser until the rage softened enough to let me think. It was then that the plan formed, not as an explosion, but as a series of adjustments, a choreography of small, decisive movements that would require patience and timing and the courage to do what I had always avoided, because I had liked to believe that decency could outweigh treachery. When the second escalation finished unfurling itself through the house, when the cameras blinked and the thermostat ticked cold and the brochures gleamed from the coffee table with their false gardens, I understood that I would not convince him back. Into the sun, I remembered, that reason was a language he had chosen to unlearn, and that my path now ran through action rather than discussion. I sharpened my resolve the way a man sharpens a blade he hopes never to use. I mapped the creaks in the floorboards outside his room. I timed the beeps of the safe and practiced the stealth of my hands on the carpet so that even the dust would not be disturbed. And I waited with a patience that surprised me, because beneath the fear and humiliation, something calmer had taken root, a determination not born of hatred, but of duty. To the woman I loved, who had trusted me with this house, to the younger man I once was, who had hammered these studs in summer sweat, and even to the old man I am now, who still deserves a roof that does not despise him. I knew there would be a night when the house would hold its breath with me, when his sleep would deepen into the oblivion that follows liquor, when the safe would surrender its paper secrets to the numbers I had memorized, and when I would carry those secrets into the dark yard where the rusting burn barrel waited, and there I would feed the fire with the lie he had written about my life, not out of vengeance alone, but to reclaim the truth I had allowed him to smother under the polite name of help. The night it finally happened was one of those nights when the house seemed to hold its breath, as if even the old wood sensed that something decisive was about to unfold. Daniel had drunk himself into that deep, heavy sleep that comes only after a long evening with the bottle, and I knew because I had stood at the bottom of the stairs and listened to the silence that followed his door slamming shut, the silence broken only by a sudden thud of his shoes hitting the floor and the occasional cough that told me his chest was thick with liquor and fatigue. I waited longer still, pacing the kitchen with my heart pounding against my ribs as though testing their strength, until the clock read just past 2 in the morning, that dead zone when even the restless dogs outside had given up their barking. It was then that I made my move, every step deliberate, every breath measured, carrying with me not just anger, but the cold clarity of a man who has been cornered for too long and now sees only one exit. I crept up the stairs barefoot, careful to avoid the boards I had long known would creak, and paused outside his door. His snoring rumbled through the crack, uneven but steady enough to reassure me he was gone, to that oblivion he never earned, but claimed every night from the bottle. I turned away, went to his room, and there beneath the bed was the cheap fireproof safe, squat and ugly, the keypad blinking a faint green light. I had listened for weeks to the pattern of beeps in the darkness, and I pressed the numbers now with a hand that trembled, not from fear, but from the magnitude of what I was about to do. The code was exactly as I suspected. The date of that long-ago basketball victory he had once claimed was the real day of his birth, and the safe opened with a click that seemed louder than thunder in the still house. Inside was the proof of all his schemes. The forged lease he had thrust at me, fresh copies with his signature neat and firm beside my own shaky scrawl from the day he had tried to force my hand, only this time the document was stamped and notarized by someone I had never met, a stranger's validation of a lie meant to strip me of everything. Alongside it were envelopes with bank statements that did not belong to him, my accounts with withdrawal slips already filled in, papers that showed he had tried to position himself as power of attorney, letters drafted to social services whispering of my supposed decline, a dossier built on fabrications ready to be deployed the moment he decided it was time to declare me incompetent. Holding them in my hands, I felt the weight of his betrayal settle into something sharper than sorrow, a resolve as cold as the night air slipping through the cracked window. I gathered every page, every slip, every counterfeit proof of my supposed weakness, and carried them down to the yard where the rusting burn barrel stood waiting like a sentinel. The moon hung low, its light silvery on the grass, and I struck a match with a steadiness that surprised me, feeding the flame first with the smallest sheets, watching the fire catch and flare, then dropping in the lease itself, the paper curling and blackening, the ink blistering until the words dissolved into smoke. I stood over that barrel until every scrap had turned to ash, until nothing remained of his ambitions but a faint gray dust that floated upward and vanished into the indifferent sky. But it was not enough, and I knew it. Destroying the papers meant he no longer had the weapons he planned to use, but it did not strip him of his will to dominate. He would wake in the morning, furious, tearing through the room for his missing documents, and he would suspect me at once, and then the war would break open fully. And so I did what I never thought myself capable of. I took the lease that had been hidden in the drawer of my desk, the copy he had made me sign under duress, and I tore it into long, ragged strips, letting them flutter into the fire one by one until the last fragment of my coerced surrender was nothing but embers. I returned to the house, my hands smelling of smoke, and sat at the kitchen table, waiting for dawn. When Daniel came down, bleary-eyed, the smell of char still clinging to the air, he knew instantly. His eyes darted, wide and wild, and he demanded to know what I had done. I told him calmly, in a voice that did not waver, that every lie he had prepared was gone, that his schemes had turned to ash in the barrel, and that he would never again reduce me to a signature trembling on a page. He lunged at me then, his face twisted with a rage that looked almost like fear, his hands gripping my shirt front as if he meant to shake compliance back into me. But I did not flinch. For the first time in years, I looked him square in the eyes without blinking, and what he saw there was not weakness, but finality. "You will not take this house from me," I said, each word slow and deliberate. "You will not take my name, my dignity, or my memory. This is my home, and I would rather see it in ruins than let you steal it." He froze, his grip slackening as though the strength had bled out of him, and for a moment the silence between us was so deep it felt as though the house itself listened. Then he released me, shoving me back into the chair, muttering that I was insane, that I would regret this, that without his guidance, I would fall into ruin. But his words rang hollow now, stripped of their power, because I had taken back the one thing he could never replace, the right to decide my own fate. That morning, marked the climax of our war, not because fists were raised or blood was shed, but because the balance had shifted irreversibly. I had burned his weapons, and in doing so I had set fire to the chains he had wrapped around me. Whatever came next, his vengeance, his plotting, his eventual departure, I knew I had reclaimed the ground of my life. The house still stood, and so did I, and for the first time in too many years, I no longer felt like a guest in my own home. When the fire had eaten the last scraps of his ambition, and the morning sun broke pale and cold across the yard, I sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee that tasted stronger than any I had brewed in years. Not because the beans were different, but because I drank it with the knowledge that something inside me had shifted permanently. Daniel moved through the house that morning like a storm without thunder, slamming doors, searching drawers, pulling cushions from chairs as though the missing documents might have been misplaced rather than destroyed. And each time, his eyes met mine. I held his gaze until he turned away, unable to find in me the trembling submission he had once counted on. He shouted that I was ruining both our lives, that I was too old to manage, that the world would devour me if he did not stand between me and it. But his voice rang empty in the air because I had seen the truth of his intentions and burned them too. Ash, ash. And there was no going back to the illusion of care he once used as a mask. The days that followed were heavy with tension, yet I walked with a steadiness that surprised me, rising earlier than him, sweeping the porch, trimming the hedges, restoring to the house the quiet order he had tried to replace with chaos. He threatened to call the authorities again to tell them I was dangerous to myself, and I answered simply that he was welcome to try, because I had already spoken to the lawyer whose card I had tucked away months ago, and to the pastor who knew my mind was as clear as ever, and even to the neighbor who had seen me mow the lawn and share conversations with perfect coherence. The lies he had prepared had no soil to root in anymore, because I had anticipated them and armed myself with proof of my sanity. Each time he tried to loom over me, I reminded him with calm words that the house was mine, the deed secured, the will rewritten with protections that left him no claim. And the more I spoke these truths aloud, the smaller he seemed, as though stripped of the shadows in which his power had grown. One evening, perhaps a week after the night of the fire, he came into the living room while I was polishing the frame of Margaret's photograph, and he stood there watching me for a long moment before he said, in a voice softer than I had heard in years, 6 years, that he had only wanted to make things easier, that he was drowning in debts I could never understand, that his anger had come from desperation rather than malice. For the briefest heartbeat, I almost believed him, because the lines of weariness in his face were real, and because the part of me that had once carried him on my shoulders still longed for reconciliation. But I remembered the smirk when he told me to kneel, the forged papers, the staged kindness at the breakfast table, the realtor touring the house as if it already belonged to someone else. And I knew that sorrow does not erase betrayal, and that forgiveness cannot be given to someone who only repents because they have lost. I told him quietly that I wished him no harm, that I would always hope he found a better life, but that he would no longer live in this house, and his answer was silence so thick I could hear the air leave his lungs before he turned and walked. Upstairs. 2 days later, he was gone. He left behind a mess of clothes, a few empty bottles, and the bitter smell of resentment that clung to the walls for a time. But the house itself seemed to breathe easier, the way a room smells fresher once a window is opened. I did not chase him, did not call to demand a forwarding address, did not beg him to return. I let the silence settle and fill the corners where his noise had lived, and in that silence I found something close to peace. The cameras came down one by one. The thermostat cover went into the trash. The pantry was restored to its order. And for the first time in years, the rooms felt like mine again. Not because of ownership written on paper, but because my spirit once more inhabited every corner. I walked from room to room, speaking aloud the names of things: chair, table, rug, window, bed. Not to prove my memory, but to reclaim them from the shadow of his contempt. And with each word, the house felt warmer, as if Margaret herself had drawn a quilt across my shoulders. I know the world outside has changed, that neighbors gossip about the son who vanished, that bills still come and life still demands its steady toll. But what remains is the certainty that I did not yield, that I did not surrender the last sanctuary of my life to greed disguised as help. I have no illusions about loneliness. The evenings are still quiet, and sometimes the silence stretches too far. But it is a silence I choose, not one imposed on me by fear or humiliation. I tend the garden again, planting late bulbs that will bloom in spring. And when I sit on the porch with my coffee, I imagine Margaret's laughter drifting on the wind, and I tell her that the house is safe, that I kept my promise, that even against our own blood I held the line. Perhaps one day Daniel will return, not with papers or demands, but with a genuine wish for forgiveness. And if that day comes, I will listen, though I cannot say what my answer will be. But until then, this house is mine, not just in deed, but in spirit. And each creak of the floorboards, each tick of the hallway clock, each breath of air through the open window is a reminder that I endured, that I resisted, that I remained. In the end, that is enough.